Please be seated. Okay, I'm going to read Holy Scripture now. You ready? You ready? When Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put on some clothes, for he was naked, and jumped into the sea. But the other disciples came in the boat. What? Okay, so it's probably TMI, right? Too much information. Peter was fishing naked. That's what's going on here, right? Now, why did he do that? Probably because he didn't want to get his clothes dirty. I don't know. In the Pacific Northwest, where it rained a lot, some of the local folks early, before the Europeans came, used to be out in the rain naked, and then they'd come in and warm up. So Peter had this immediacy, this raw nakedness that's part of who he is. And he shows us that, and others who talk about him show us that. Peter is the disciple who grows, who matures, who before our eyes goes from someone who, what's he do? He betrays Jesus and he matures into someone who builds the church. And he does it this way, awkwardly. A little weird, right? I think of him this has nothing to do with our vicar, but Action Jackson, just like, he's the active guy here. Look. Well, he's active also. He's the one who's jumping in the sea. He's the one who gets the net. He's very active. It's like he's nervous and trying to prove himself to Jesus. And so he's got this nakedness. Now, the kids were into that this morning as we had our earlier service, because some of their dads fish. So I was like, do your dads fish naked? Do your moms fish naked? No. So the boat they were in, this little girl was asking me, is about from this pillar bow to that pillar stern, bow to stern, and maybe about as wide as from where I am to where the tile ends and the pews start. Not very big. People could handle it. It could handle a storm and some fish, but you could also be scared there. So this is the environment they're in. These are fisher people who, after Jesus' death and resurrection, essentially go back home and go to work. That's what they're doing. They're not somewhere else when they see the risen Christ. And I think that's part of the point for us. You don't have to go to a mountaintop to see the risen Christ. In fact, the message here is that you will see the risen Christ in your daily life. That's part of it. And it begins with this gospel by taking us sort of inside, right? They're outside working. They see Jesus, and you hear the ambivalence by, now none of the disciples dared to ask Jesus, "Who are you?" because they knew it was the Lord. Why would they say that if they weren't quite sure, right? You hear the ambivalence? They didn't ask because they knew, but they wanted to ask, but they didn't because they knew, but they weren't sure, right? When you see the risen Christ walking around the sidewalks here, are you really sure? Are you absolutely sure? Or is it a little bit like, wait, did that? I think it's more like that, right? Like, oh, wait, I think there's a reflective piece to experiencing God. There's a nurturing piece to experiencing God. And we see that here because after that ambivalence, they're not going to ask him because they know it's him, but they really want to ask. After that, they have the food. Come and eat breakfast, Jesus says. So he's like their mother, right? Come, eat. You've been working. Let me feed you. You notice in many of the resurrection appearances, the disciples, whoever it is, begins to see the risen Christ once they share fellowship together. They kind of go inside. They go away from their daily work. They come to church, whatever it is. They reflect. So there's this season of life that Jesus shows us in his life on earth. Action, reflection. Action, reflection. Not all action, not all reflection, but this rhythm of life. This rhythm of life where we're willing to come inside. We're willing to pause. We might call it practice Sabbath. Sabbath rest is not sort of relaxing on a day off. It's embracing the life-giving force of God in whatever way you can do that, and not fighting against death. It's embracing life. And so these are practicing Sabbath in everyday life simply by sitting down with Jesus and having a meal where they went. You can imagine the hunger and the rawness and putting on clothes when you're wet and taking them off and sitting down and eating delicious, fresh fish. This is when they began to open. And this is when Jesus knows that Peter's heart is open. So he drills right into it. He's essentially saying, look, when I feed you, then you go out and feed others. Don't say thank you and walk away full. I feed you, Jesus says to Peter, so you can feed others. So they can feed others. So they can feed others. In some ways, a Eucharistic church like we are that shares the Eucharist is really simply about eating together. That's the principal part of our liturgy. That's the longest part of our liturgy. We come here and we eat together. And sometimes I will admit, as I'm handing out the Eucharist, it's a little round wafer. And you all come forward. And we do it every Sunday. It's so ordinary and yet so strangely powerful because we can put our hopes and dreams into the bread and the wine. We have something physical and we take it in and we pause. I invite you to, as you come forward this time, let it come in. Let it go into your body. If it's not your tradition, just receive a blessing. It all works. But let it come in. Let it come in. Find your place of Sabbath. Find your place of openness. It's not necessarily equilibrium. It's just how are you open? How do you rest so that Jesus can come to you again and nourish you in a way that you're ready to nourish others? It's not all about you or me. It's about being nourished in a way that we then can serve others. There's a two-part. And Peter shows us, and through Peter we see it. Jesus had to rough him up a bit, right? Because Peter betrayed him. So he pushes Peter, and he's preparing Peter. And he loves Peter enough to really give him some trouble. So we have this inside-outside aspect to the risen Christ. And we need both sides to really open our hearts to see Christ on the sidewalk and in our daily lives. To prepare us for the kind of experience that Ananias had. So now I'm in Acts, and Acts of the Apostles. Ananias was a holy man, and he knew there was a guy named Saul at the time, who was looking for people like him to kill him. So imagine Ananias probably saw Paul like ISIS. Like we see ISIS or something. You're somewhere and you've got the wrong passport. And people are checking, it's like really, you're dead. That's where Ananias saw Paul. Paul had papers, legal papers to round up Christians. So Paul was going about his daily life when he gets knocked off the horse. The resurrected Christ comes to everyone in their regular, ordinary life. Paul was doing his job. And so was Ananias. Just pause for a second and try to put your heart in that space that Ananias must have been in when the voice came to him. Go see Saul. I bet each one of you is being told to go see Saul right now. I bet each one of you has that, oh no, Lord, I'm not doing that. No, I don't have that in me. What is it for you? What are you resisting right now? What scares the living daylights out of you? Who is your Saul? Who's trying to kill you? Who's trying to destroy you? What is trying to destroy you? I'm not inviting you to be paranoid. I'm just asking, what are you afraid of? We probably add a little to the fear, right? We probably contribute to some of our fear. But notice in Acts how basically Paul's just doing his job. And that's when Jesus comes to him. And then notice there's a bunch of witnesses in that second paragraph. A bunch of people who saw it. And I've been bringing this into some of the sermons I've been preaching. There are witnesses, folks, and they're watching you, and you're being watched. You have, as what Shakespeare say, all the world's a stage. You have a platform to preach. You have a pulpit to spread the good news. It's called your daily life. That's your pulpit. And you are being watched. And people are walking with you. And they're being impacted by you. And so the question comes back, what are you preaching? What are you offering? What are you bringing to them? We see that when there's witnesses, courage is possible. That's the other side. It's hard to be courageous without the support of witnesses. And so being aware that we're witnessing is being witnessed is one thing, but also being aware that we too are witnesses, that we are never just a bystander. We're always a part of whatever problem or human brokenness that we see. We're always part of it. We're never removed. We are a witness, and other people are witnesses, and they're watching. That is the occasion for courage, for courageous faith, for stepping out, back out of the meal that we have here, back into the world, ready to go. You know what Ananias says? I didn't circle it, but he said, "Here I am." You remember Abraham. Every time God goes to Abraham, "Here I am." One time I was way up in Canada on this canoe trip, and it had been 3 weeks, and I was 15. We were hungry. It's at the end, and we're standing there. It's really cold. There's no streets outside of the town. We had to take a railroad out. And we're in the railroad station, and one of the guys, Doug, had saved a bunch of money. We were all broke because we spent it all on food. He had saved money to buy Mom and Dad a gift. And there's a guy on the platform asking for money. And Doug was in his backpack, or his duffel bag, and someone asked for money. He says, "I have money." I'm like, "Doug, you don't want to spend it." Anyway, so how do you be like Doug and just say, "Here I am"? When it's inconvenient, when it's not according to your goal, but when God calls, how do you prepare to say, "Here I am"? What was in Ananias to open up that way? And what do you need in your own heart? What nourishment, what company, what thoughts prepare you to open? I have a friend who calls it keeping good company. It says our thoughts begin to influence our actions. If we have to be careful what we focus on and which thoughts we carry, because we begin to see what we are thinking. We start to look for it. And so part of this is holy habits, where we reflect on the risen Christ and acknowledge that we can actually engage the risen Christ, that we can see Christ in this world, that we can live a life, a practice, and a habit life that guides us in that direction. So when we go to a street called straight, as Ananias was called to do, go straight to it. Don't delay. Go now. When we have that admonition to us, and we have the ear of our heart is open to hear it, when we can hear that voice calling, how do we answer? "Here I am. Here I am." And then have the courage to go to the bully, to the one who wants to destroy us, to the concept, the thought, the group, the whatever it is that's going to destroy who we are. And it's not so much destroy, but deny us. And you know that feeling, you've been denied? It hurts. It's like, there's nothing that makes you feel more low than being denied. So we remember that Peter denied Jesus 3 times, and yet Jesus came back to him. There's always life after denial. And some of us, maybe that denial is what being denied and entering that really low space is what allows us to see. Maybe we have to strip some of ourselves away before we can say, here I am, here I am. So Ananias went and entered the house and called Saul his brother. The person who was going to destroy him is now a family member, a brother, a sister. Close. There's a commitment, an innate commitment. How do we do that? How do we see each person on the street as a brother or sister? How do we open our heart? John, who writes 50 years after Paul, at least, I forget when was Luke Acts written? Does someone shout that out? Is it in the 60s? Someone Google it, will you, and yell it out when you have it. I'll keep going, but I didn't do all my homework. I know Paul wrote about 50 years before John. So 50 years after Paul, John's talking about lamb power, if you go to page 10 in the Revelation to John. This is how John sees it, because he's lived with the risen Christ in the community now for 50 years. John lived a long time, wrote at the end of his life. He says, listen to this. The thief and the Jesus who was on the cross for a capital crime of treason, now listen to him. This is the Lamb. Worthy is the Lamb that was slaughtered, that's Jesus, to receive power and wealth and wisdom and might and honor and glory and blessing. Power, wealth, wisdom, might, honor, glory, blessing. Lamb power. By going to that place of being denied, by going to the soft, vulnerable, unorganized part of ourself, by becoming Peter in our own lives, putting on our clothes and jumping in the water, whatever it is, by going to that place, there is the power of the risen Christ. And I pray that you do whatever you need to do to open your heart in that space. And then give it to others.